John Adams was inaugurated as the second president of the United States on March 4th, 1797. To fully understand the situation that he inherited, we need to step back to Washington's second term as president. During Washington's second term, war had broken out between Great Britain and France. The United States had declared itself neutral. It was not going to take sides in this war. So it had continued to trade with both Great Britain and France. And this proved to irritate both countries. Great Britain started capturing any American ships that it saw trading with France, and France began capturing any American ships that it caught trading with Great Britain. Eventually, Washington dispatched Chief Justice John Jay to Great Britain, and he had negotiated what has gone down as Jay's Treaty. And this treaty had essentially restored peace between the United States and Great Britain. Great Britain agreed to evacuate its forts in the American Northwest Territory, and it had agreed to repay the United States for the ships, by this point, the hundreds of ships that it had seized. This, in turn, angered France. France viewed Jay's Treaty as some kind of alliance between Great Britain and the United States. And so when John Adams is sworn in, France is responding to Jay's Treaty by seizing American ships at a higher rate than it already had been. So Adams now turns his attention to making peace with France, and he sends 3 American ambassadors. They get to France, and they meet with 3 French ambassadors. Now, in their reports back to President Adams, these American negotiators referred to these 3 Frenchmen as X, Y, and Z. They would not use their actual names for whatever reason. Well, these 3 French negotiators refuse to even meet with the Americans until they're paid, I want to say somewhere around $10 or $15 million. Essentially, they're telling these Americans, pay us a little money, and then we can talk about not taking your ships anymore. Well, these American negotiators, of course, respond by saying, no, you're either going to agree to stop taking our ships, or you're not. We're not going to pay you just to talk. Word of this gets back both to President Adams and to the American public at large. And because these 3 Frenchmen were known as X, Y, and Z, this becomes known as the XYZ affair. This, of course, is an outrage to the American public. They felt that France had greatly disrespected the United States by demanding this bribe. And so, unfortunately for Adams, after the XYZ affair, it appears that the United States and France are on the brink of war. And so, Adams is going to continue to try and make peace with France, but at the same time, he is going to begin preparing for war just in case it comes to that. Now, in their preparations for war, Congress does a number of things. For one, Congress increases the size of the American army. And Adams actually convinces George Washington to come out of retirement and serve as general-in-chief. Washington would agree to do this under one condition. He asked that his old aide-de-camp and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton serve as his second-in-command. So the two men would work together one last time until Washington passed away in December of 1799. He was making a ride around his plantation, Mount Vernon, and it began to rain. He made his way back to the plantation house. He had dinner guests who were waiting for him, and he didn't want to keep them waiting, so he went to dinner in his wet clothes. He became ill, developed a throat infection, and eventually died from that infection. At the same time, Adams establishes the Department of the Navy, but there's one final piece of preparation that will ultimately ruin Adams's reputation, and this is the Alien and Sedition Acts. So, Congress, thinking that war might be on the horizon, passes a series of laws that are aimed at French aliens. Now, of course, when you're in a social studies class, when we talk about aliens, we're not talking about Area 51. We're talking about citizens of another country who are living in the United States. Now, this does not mean they are here illegally. According to the Constitution, in order to become an American citizen, a foreigner who moves into the United States must live here legally with the government's permission for 5 years. And they must also meet a series of other requirements before they will finally receive their American citizenship. Well, many Americans are worried that French aliens living in the United States are not going to prove to be very loyal to the United States if war breaks out between the United States and France. They fear that they will ultimately be loyal to their home country. So, Congress passes these laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts, one of which says aliens must wait 14 years for citizenship. So remember, it had been 5 years. This law is going to extend that to 14 years. It also says that any foreign aliens that are considered dangerous, if a French immigrant were to encourage a rebellion against the American, or if a French immigrant were to simply stir up support for the French government, the American government could consider this person dangerous and either imprison them or even deport them back to their home country. The final law that is passed by Congress is the Sedition Act. Now, what exactly is sedition? Sedition means you are encouraging the overthrow of the government. And according to this law, any criticism of the American government became a crime. You could go to jail, and some people did go to jail for criticizing the government. Now, these laws were passed by Congress, by the legislative branch, but any law has to be signed by the president. So the fact that Adams agreed to these laws by signing them really hurt his reputation. Obviously, this final law was a blatant violation of the First Amendment. You can't prevent people from, or you can't make it illegal to speak badly about government officials. That's an obvious violation of the freedom of speech. Adams's own vice president, Thomas Jefferson, and his fellow Virginian, James Madison, write a series of documents that are known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, because they are eventually approved by the state legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky. And they basically say that a state can ignore any national law that it thinks is unconstitutional. Now, obviously, this is not a great idea, because a state could then ignore any law. It could say any law is unconstitutional. And this is actually something that will come back and prove to be a problem in American history. But that's a little further down the road from where we're currently at. So once the negotiations during the XYZ affair failed, this leads to what we call the quasi-war. Quasi means unofficial or undeclared. In this case, this is an undeclared war between France and the United States. You actually do have some battles that occur between French and American ships. However, although he is preparing for war, Adams continues to seek a peaceful resolution. And eventually, in 1800, the French and the United States sign the Treaty of Mortefontaine, which agrees, in which the French agree to stop seizing American ships. Now, the reason why France signed this treaty is because Napoleon Bonaparte had just overthrown the French government. He was preparing to go to war with essentially everyone else in Europe. He would eventually conquer Spain and much of the rest of Europe. He did not want to be sidetracked by a war with the United States. So he agreed to stop seizing American ships. Now, you would think that this would be seen as a positive development. The fact that the conflict with France was ended in a peaceful manner. But this angers many Federalists because they support Britain. And the fact that their president, John Adams, has signed a treaty with France is very irritating for many of them. And so many Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, who's the leader of the Federalist Party, turned their backs on John Adams. And this occurs just as Adams is preparing to run for re-election. And the man he will be running against is his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson. And that is where we will pick up with the next lesson.